This is a session called Land, Resistance, and Law in Occupied Palestine. We are lucky to be joined by two guests, whom I will introduce in just a moment. But first, I'd like to thank the student organizations who co-sponsored this event. They are the Middle Eastern South Asian Law Students Association, the Latinx Law Students Association, the Muslim Law Students Association, the Asian Pacific American Law Students, and Outlaw. And thanks to Sadaf Doost for all of the work that they put in to this event. Our speakers for this panel are Jamil Dakwar, who is a human rights lawyer and chair of Adalah Justice Project board. He was born and raised in Haifa, and he was the founding lawyers of Adalah, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. He teaches human rights at John Jay Criminal Justice at Hunter College and at Bard College, and he will be speaking in his personal capacity and not as an ACLU staff member. Also on the panel is Tallie Ben-Daniel, Director of Special Projects at A Jewish Voice for Peace. She received her PhD from UC Davis in Cultural Studies and is currently working on a book manuscript titled Gay Capital, San Francisco, Tel-Aviv, and the Politics of Settler-Colonialism. So this program came about because a lot of law students were interested in learning more about Israel and Palestine and what's going on there right now. And so we want to focus on questions of law. But I'm hoping we can start by defining some terms and getting a little bit of history for those who may not be familiar with what's going on at the moment. So I'm hoping that each of you might be able to offer 2 minutes of a quick description of recent events going on at the moment. And Tallie, would you mind starting? Can't hear you.
You would think after a year I would figure out how to unmute myself on Zoom. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with everyone. And yes, I would be delighted to. So not sure where to start. This always is a little bit tricky, right? But let's start with the events of the last couple of weeks. There's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah that is one of the most contested neighborhoods in Israel-Palestine. There's a longer history as to why it's contested, but suffice it to say that some families, Palestinian families, have lived in this neighborhood for generations at this point. And there's Israeli settler organizations that have said that they have claimed this neighborhood for themselves. And so there's been ongoing eviction cases over the years, honestly, around this neighborhood. This is a very long-standing conflict in this neighborhood, right? And if you pay attention at all to Israeli politics, which I'm not sure if anyone here has, it has gotten progressively more right-wing as the years have gone by. So we just came out of a pretty right-wing administration we had 4 years of Donald Trump, and we saw that the right was really empowered when Donald Trump was president, right? We saw what happened in January 6th at the Capitol. We saw QAnon conspiracy, all of those things happening empowered by the president. The just recently previous prime minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, has been prime minister for 12 years. So the far right is extremely empowered. And these far right groups came into the neighborhood and started harassing people, pulling them out of their homes, beating them up, increasing violence. Police came in, didn't quite do anything but exacerbate the violence. And part of what happened was Palestinians from across Palestine, right? So in this neighborhood, in the West Bank, in Gaza, which are these different territories that are under Israeli control where Palestinians live, sort of rose up in response to the violence. This is also happening during Ramadan, which is a very sacred time for Muslims, and not all Palestinians are Muslim. Palestinians are many different religions, but enough understand the importance of the sacred time that they responded to the violence that was happening. So that's the sort of immediate past couple weeks, some stuff that's happened in the past couple weeks. There's obviously a much longer history, but I don't know how much time I've taken up. So I'm just going to stop there and see where the questions lead us.
Let's see. I was bumped out of the room for part of that, but no, not your fault. Jamil, would you mind giving a summary of what's going on the human rights front?
Sure. First, thank you very much for organizing this conversation. I really appreciate it. It's particularly for the students who are studying for the bar. Appreciate taking the time off when you want to rest between the two days of preparation. So glad to be part of it. Well, the human rights situation has been in deteriorating and going really from bad to worse for a number of years. And I think that we have seen an unprecedented human rights assault or assault on human rights in general in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And what is really important to keep in mind is that it just got to the headlines in the United States because of the war on Gaza. These human rights violations happen on a daily basis. The oppression and systemic racism in Israel, whether it's against Palestinian citizens who comprise 20% of Israel's population. I'm one of them, although I'm also an American citizen now, but I've lived about 30 years of my life in Israel and practiced human rights law there. And I can tell you that the recent events have were unprecedented because of the way that it erased any borders or fragmentation that the Israeli government tried to do, meaning the fragmentation or distinction between Palestinian citizens inside Israel and Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, in occupied East Jerusalem, and the ones who live on the West Bank under occupation, or the ones who live under the blockade in Gaza, or for that matter, even brought in solidarity and in community together, even the Palestinian refugees outside the homeland. And that has been, I think, the most important part of what we saw the last 2 or 3 weeks, because it shows that particularly the movement that's led by young Palestinians that are fearless, that are not going to let any Israeli government, no matter what's its identity. Tallie mentioned that it's true that recent years Israeli government become more and more right-wing and more racist, blatantly racist. But to be honest, for Palestinians, this has been the case since 1948. We have lived through this by the fact that Israel was established on the ruins of our homeland. It has created a legal system that gives more privileges, rights to Jewish people, and people who are not Jewish, in this case mostly Palestinians, are really relegated to at best second-class status. And we will talk more about that domination of what does it mean to have this kind of system and how it manifested itself. So I would say that human rights as a whole have been highlighted more than ever by the recent also reports that were issued by Israeli and American International Human Rights Organization, Human Rights Watch. Again, the analysis that has been already made and done by Palestinian and other international scholars who have linked the connections between Israeli policies all over historic Palestine, where one thing to keep in mind that Israel controls and governs all Palestinians, the 6.8 million Palestinians who live from the river to the sea, as well as governs the 6.8 million Jewish Israelis who live in the problem is that there are 2 different legal regimes, sometimes even more than one legal regime and legal setting and legal framework that applies to Palestinians, but there's one legal framework that applies to Israelis, where they are given the right to self-determination exclusively, as was cemented or upheld by the 2018 Jewish nation state law. Its settlement of Jewish settlements being recognized as only unique for the Jewish population in historic Palestine, and the freedom of movement and travel is also exclusively enjoyed by Jewish Israelis, whether they are settlers in the West Bank, whether they are settlers in East Jerusalem, or whether they are just Jewish Israeli citizens who live inside Israel. That in of itself is the reality that creates a number of international human rights violations that really rise to the level of systemic racism and oppression of one racial group over another racial group, which is the definition of apartheid.
Okay. Now, the terms racism are being applied to this conflict, and sometimes this is described as religious conflict, sometimes political conflict. Can you both clarify the terms you're using and how you come to those? Jamil, would you mind starting?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a lot of attempts to portray and to present the situation as a religious conflict. It is not. It is by definition a situation of deprivation, displacement, dispossession of indigenous community, the Palestinian indigenous community in Palestine, historic Palestine, by first started as a Jewish settler who moved to Palestine during the Ottoman era, Ottoman Empire era, the end of 19th century, going through the 20th century of British mandate, and then the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, which basically completed the Zionist project of dispossession of the land from the indigenous community. And so it's never been really a religious at the core. The religion is used in order to justify violations of serious violations of human rights, in order to justify the taking of land, in order to justify the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, that exclusive ethno-national state. But it is not a religious conflict. And certainly there are religious sites, most important religious sites for all religions, including for Judaism, and it has to be respected, it has to be protected. But I think what we have seen over the last decades is that by turning it into a religious conflict, it added more harm, it added more suffering, and it had more devastation to communities, both for Palestinians, of course, which were the victims of the main victims of such actions, but also for Jewish people who moved, whether they were living there before 1948 or moved to Israel as immigrants. And I don't think that anyone can really claim that by thinking that this is a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. This is not really. This is about the ideology of Zionism that has created and took advantage of a very difficult, extremely difficult situation where Jews have been subjected to persecution and anti-Semitism, and ultimately led to the Holocaust and the mass killing and the genocide against Jewish people, and took advantage of that, both the real suffering and a need for protection and refuge, as well as the idea of that need to be a place that will protect all Jews in one place. And I think that is what Zionism was trying to do, and many Jews resisted that, continue to resist that, including major movements in Europe who resisted that, like the Bund in Poland and in Eastern Europe. And I think that we're seeing more and more of that. So a religious conflict, I think that it's not a conflict, and I think conflict assumes that there is two parties that are equal, at least somehow equal, but there's really, at this point, we are talking about a situation where there's a country that is also one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world, the eighth, I think, largest and most powerful in the world, is fighting the indigenous community in both dire situations, whether it's in Gaza, the West Bank, and depriving Palestinians their basic human rights on every day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just want to expand a little bit about what Jamil's saying. Jamil used the term Zionism, and I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a minute with there to expand on this idea that I completely agree, it's not a religious conflict, it's not a conflict. There's a political ideology called Zionism that is fueling a lot of what we're seeing Israel's behavior right now and since 1948. So Judaism is a religion. It is also it's like an ethno-religion, right? So it's not just a religion in the same way that one would think of Christianity, that is sort of like what you believe is what matters, right? For Judaism, it's a little bit of family and heritage. You can convert into Judaism. It is a religion, but there's also secular Judaism that doesn't really think about belief in God. The Bund, the anti-Zionists, were famously extremely secular. So just to clarify, like, Jews are kind of complicated. We're a kind of complicated group, right? My family, historically, my mom was born in Iraq. Like, my family has generations and generations and generations in Iraq. So it's not like Arabs versus Jews. I'm also Arab, right? So there's just like a little bit not as like Muslims and Jews is a you're going to not see all the different components of what's happening here. What Zionism is basically Jewish nationalism. It came out of Europe. There were many different sort of threads in the beginning of what Zionism was, but what ultimately went out was this political ideology that said all Jews everywhere are part of the same nation, and we therefore need our own state, and that should be just Jewish, right? And they did a lot of cultural work and a lot of work within Judaism to make this a palatable idea. A lot of Jewish people didn't like this idea. My grandparents were like, we're Iraqi, we don't want to leave Iraq. We've been in Iraq for generations. Why would I want to go anywhere else, right? So they found parts of Jewish texts that uses the term Zion and said, look, we've always been a nation. They developed the modern Hebrew language and said all Jews should now speak modern Hebrew language. They started doing, they appropriated Palestinian dances and said, these are now Jewish cultural dances that are everyone's folk dances, right? So they did a lot of cultural and religious work to create and intertwine Zionism and Judaism, to the point where now a lot of Jewish people really do think of Zionism as a sort of expression of Jewish identity, right? But it is a political ideology, and it is an ideology that wants to claim land and says that this is Jewish land, when in reality, this is territory that has been shared for millennia, right? This has not been exclusively Jewish land ever, right? There's always been Jewish people on the land, but that doesn't mean that it's only been Jewish people on the land. So that's sort of hopefully a helpful expansion on what Jamil is saying.
So some people claim that the movement for Palestinian human rights is fueling anti-Semitism in some ways. Tallie, would you be able to speak to that?
I would love to. This is a very well-used way to distract from what is happening to Palestinians and what has been happening to Palestinians for many, many years at this point, 73 years at this point. Anti-Semitism exists, and it is everywhere, right? It is part of the sort of structures that we are all living in, racism and sexism, homophobia, and anti-Semitism. And part of what this argument is saying is that there's something about the Palestinian existence or Palestinian resistance to Israeli human rights violations that somehow increases people's anti-Semitism. And that's just not factually true, right? And the folks who are claiming that are using definitions of anti-Semitism that are purposefully very, very broad to make it seem like whenever you criticize the Israeli government that you are being anti-Semitic. So one of the biggest organizations that does this is the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which just recently came out with an anti-Semitism tracker. But if you look at the incidents of anti-Semitism that they're tracking, one of the incidents would be saying that Israel is a racist state. Israel is a racist state. The US is also a racist state. This is not an anti-Christian, anti-US statement to say, it's just a statement of fact. My family, again, is Arab and lives in Israel now and experience racism as Arab Jews. Palestinians experience a huge amount of racism in Israel and in occupied territories. This is just a factual statement. It is not anti-Semitic to say that this government is racist, right? So that's part of what is happening. And you know, especially coming out of the Trump era, I just want to be very clear, anti-Semitism is a true and real threat, and it is something that we have to work on dismantling as progressive people and as people who care about human rights for everybody. That's a non-negotiable, right? And many Palestinians who are activists and many Palestinian organizations have made it extremely clear that this is a movement for human rights and that there's no place for anti-Semitism in the movement. One thing that we use when we talk about this in activist circles is we use the word PEP, right? So this is progressive except Palestine, where you're like, you're pro gay rights and you're pro all of the like beautiful progressive, you want to fight climate change and do all these things, but Palestine's kind of your red line. You like can't really see the Palestine issue. We also say POOP, right? Which is progressive only on Palestine. So folks who are only wanting to fight for Palestinian rights, but who are kind of like not really wanting to fight anti-Semitism or sexism or homophobia, and that's the only thing that they do, right? So we're Palestinian human rights are a progressive human rights issue, so there's no place for anti-Semitism there. But that narrative that it increases in because of Palestinian advocacy is a false one.
If I may, you know, thanks, Tallie. This is really great. You know, description is really what is happening. But the danger of this is also the way that's been used to silence and shut down activism, legitimate criticism, both of Israel and Zionism. Again, as Tallie said, Zionism is a political ideology, and then there's no there's no basis for the argument that by criticizing Israel or the legitimacy of Zionism, meaning whether Israel is legitimately a state that should be exclusively a Jewish state, not, for example, be a democratic state, could be defined as anti-Semitic and therefore illegitimate way of organizing and speech, etc. And they become like a hate speech or hate organizing associations. And that in of itself has become a real danger to First Amendment protections. We're seeing more and more student activism particularly, but also academics who are subject to these kinds of tactics of turning, redefining anti-Semitism in a way that will be the focus is really anti-Israelism. And that is really what those who were behind the efforts in the United States in particular to move from distracting from the real threats to Jewish people, particularly for white nationalists, into portraying the Palestinian rights movement as a hate movement. And that I think is something that is being resisted. It's unfortunate that the Biden administration continues the Clinton and, well, Obama-Clinton administration. In between, there was Trump, but before Trump, the first to take that step of accepting this controversial definition of anti-Semitism was really the State Department under the Clinton as a Secretary of State, and under the Obama administration. And I think that we have some more and more documentation that suggests that this is not done in order to protect and to ensure safety of Jewish people or students or in general. In fact, if anything, it is again distracting from these real threats that we saw over the last 4 years or 5 years, culminating up to the January 6th attack on Congress, but also murderous attacks on Jewish worshippers, citizens all over the country. That doesn't mean that we should not be aware of rooting out the conflation between Jews and Zionism, and then that it happens for so many people who are sometimes very much supportive of the Palestinian cause. And we have to be clear, as Tallie said, that if believing in the Palestinian rights is not negating, is not taking rights from anyone else. It's actually upholding everyone's rights to equality, justice, and freedom. And only through this collective liberation, we will be able to achieve more safety and thrive as whether individuals or collectives. And then any kind of pushing towards the direction of criminalization of speech or shutting down activism through, for example, anti-BDS laws that were mushroomed over the last several years is only an attempt to shield Israel from criticism, to really avoid discussing a very important subject, because Israel is not just another state that's violating human rights. Unlike many other countries around the world, Israel is a country that is being funded fully by the United States government, funded meaning $3.8 billion every year, where there is not only this support, military assistance, but is also diplomatic support, shielding international scrutiny, doing everything in order to protect its status as a country that is the closest US ally. So there is something that is done in the name of American citizens, whether you agree with it or not. And therefore, the urge and the urgency to act and to do something about this kind of situation.
Okay. Before we get to US involvement in the dynamics at the moment, and the social movement, as somebody who teaches criminal law, I'd like to ask a little bit about how criminal law is being used in Israel, because there seems to be a criminalization of what in the United States or in the law and society movement we tend to call everyday conduct. And I commonly hear references to self-defense as a justification for violence against Palestinian citizens. Would either of you like to speak to how criminal law is being used, or the rhetoric of criminal law is being used?
I'm happy to start, Tallie, and you can make it pick up. Actually, from the very beginning of the State of Israel, the criminal code, some of it was also adopted from the British mandate. The Israeli government actually adopted emergency regulations and instituted a state of emergency that continues to exist to this day in the State of Israel. That started in 1948, 1949, many laws that are active based on that state of emergency that have never ceased. And there were emergency regulations that were used in order to criminalize and in order to give power to the government, including in the area of civil political rights, basic civil political rights, like, for example, freedoms, press freedom and freedom of movement. Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 170,000 Palestinians who became formal Israeli citizens in 1948 to 1950, were living under Israel's military regime until 1966. And there was a whole host of ways that the government controlled their lives. They used a pass system. My parents used to have to get a permit to move from one area to another. That's not something that Israeli Jewish people who lived during that time had to do. There was also laws that were specifically enacted in order to prevent the return of refugees, Palestinian refugees. The vast majority of Palestinian people, 750,000, who were either expelled or pushed or had to leave during the war of 1948. And when they tried to come back, they called them infiltrators. and they passed a law that was criminalizing infiltrators. This same law, by the way, has been recently amended and used against migrants, African migrants who have fled violence and persecution in Africa and some African states, and made it all the way through Egypt, Sinai, into Israel, and as a result, were also criminalized. But that law from the 1950s was really used as a way to criminalize people, and in addition to, of course, the use of force, deadly force that was used against people who would try to come back, crossing the borders from Lebanon or from Jordan, in order to come back to their homes after the war ended, and yet they were prevented from doing so by force, and they were criminalized. More recently, the criminalization happens in the context of home demolitions. If you don't get a permit, and most Palestinians, again, this is happening across all parts of the country. Palestinian citizens have that problem, whether you live in the Galilee, whether you live in the Naqab, in the Negev, or you live in even the center, in the al-Fahim area, Wadi Ara. You're not likely to get a permit to build home on your own land, on your own private land, because of ways of controlling housing and building, control the demography, so that Palestinians do not expand, do not threaten the Jewish majority in certain areas. So what ends up happening, people build without permits because they can't get those permits, and then they become they commit crime because of the fact that they have violated certain laws. Most of the time, they have not only to see their homes demolished, but they have to pay for the equipment or the destruction of their homes. The most cruel and inhumane thing that you've ever seen. Those things are happening in East Jerusalem in a very escalated way. But there's been happening in the Naqab, it happened in the West Bank, particularly in Area C, where there's 60% of the West Bank, where Israel is still controlling both civilian and security situation there, and really doesn't really give any permits for Palestinians to able to grow, to build infrastructure, whether civilian, commercial, or otherwise. And there's also criminalization in the context of protests. We've seen that in the last 2-3 weeks, but that's been going on for many years. I worked as a human rights attorney with Adalah, and in 2000, in the second Intifada started, I was one of the lawyers who represented dozens of detainees, Palestinians who were protested and were detained, including minors, children, who were detained with no bond until the end of the proceedings, because they wanted to punish the protesters, and sending a message that if you ever dare to go out and protest in support of the Palestinian cause, you will be prosecuted, you will be sent to jail, and you will not be getting really due process. There's also other kinds of ways that people just, we have a poet who was criminalized, was sent by writing a poem, who lives in a Palestinian citizen. So there's it comes out in different ways, and ultimately the Israeli legal system has been a part and parcel of this oppression. Of course, here and there you will hear a good precedent and good decision that comes up, and it gets like a nice headline in the Western media, particularly in the US media, that the Israeli court did this and that. But for the most part, you really don't hear about those cases that are really criminalizing people for their legitimate actions. And last example, Islamic movement in Israel have been banned by the state of Israel. And its leaders, one of its leaders now is facing criminalization and indictment for incitement to violence. And again, incitement to violence is such a broad, usually they're like using the anti-terrorism laws in order to suppress legitimate speech. It's been going on since day one, again, back to the beginning of the state of Israel, using the military regime. But we've seen that happening, particularly after 9/11, when Israel seized on the moment that we can use the counterterrorism arguments and criminalization in order to suppress speech, and particularly nationalism, Palestinian national aspirations within the state of Israel. So you saw indictment against political leaders. You saw people who went to jail for raising flag. And the Palestinian flag for many years was banned until recently that the Attorney General said, well, now you are allowed to fly or raise the Palestinian flag, but the police have the right to take it down, to confiscate it even, if they think that that would cause disruption to the law and order on a case-by-case basis. So even a flag, even a Palestinian flag, which is a very basic thing, you can't really safely and proudly raise peacefully. And that's really what it sends a message that you're not legitimate, you don't have the same basic rights, political rights in this case, and you will be prosecuted and criminalized. And the hundreds of people who have been now arrested inside Israel, they were in a very terrorizing way, is part of a campaign that the Israeli government has declared to a law and order campaign, which really intended to silence and make sure that Palestinians inside Israel do not have any national aspirations of unity, solidarity, and not solidarity, but really struggle and resistance with their brothers and sisters in East Jerusalem or in Jerusalem or West Bank, and certainly not with Gazans, because they will be seen, as always the case, as a fifth column or a Trojan horse. That's really been the way that we've been seeing the Israeli government treating dissent and political speech and activism by Palestinians inside Israel.
Thanks.
Can I just say a
Tallie?
couple things?
Yeah.
That was wonderful. And the two things I want to say, one is kind of a smaller bit and one is a kind of larger comment. The smaller bit is that for folks who live under military rule, the Palestinians who live under military rule in the occupied territories. This is an article, I'm going to put it in the chat, from 972, which is an Israeli sort of web news reporting magazine that's published in English. They found out that the conviction rate for Palestinians in these military courts, because they're the ones who sort of oversee all criminal, civil, military, security matters for folks who are under this military occupation, had a conviction rate of over 99%. So that's not, I think that should be obvious to everyone that that is not like a fair and equitable system if the conviction rate is almost 100%, right? That anyone accused of a crime is thereby convicted is, I think, should be really good evidence for the way that the system is sort of stacked up against Palestinians in the system. I also want to expand a little bit on what Jamil was saying about the separation between these different Palestinian groups. Part of what the sort of Jewish story is a story of like being in diaspora and being separated from each other, right? And like Jews being all over the world. And part of what people who believed in Zionism, part of what they thought they were doing, there was violence and dominance, colonialism, right? But there's also this idea that all Jews would come together in Israel, right? The people who really believe in it really believe that. But the impact has been to deeply separate Palestinians from each other. And that isn't just physically, that is also in these legal structures, right? So if you're a Palestinian who lives in Gaza, you have a totally different legal structure than a Palestinian who lives in Tel Aviv, than a Palestinian who lives in East Jerusalem, than a Palestinian who lives in one neighborhood in the occupied territories versus a Palestinian who lives in another neighborhood in the occupied territories. Like it's all these very, very separate and minute and complicated systems. And part of what we saw in the last few weeks is a real unification of all these different Palestinians coming together and being in solidarity with each other, which has been quite inspiring to see.
And most Palestinians don't live in Tel Aviv, as Tallie knows, they live in Jaffa, but the point is clear.
Somehow that was the only city I could think
of. So I do want to leave time at the end to address questions that are coming in. And if other people have questions, please send them in. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the role of the United States government in the current situation. So Jamil, you spoke about the money that's flowing in. Are there other ways that the U.S. government is playing a role?
Right. So I think there's also a two-way relationship. I mean, there's rightly so. We always say U.S. provides significant amount of support, financial, military aid, diplomatic, economic, all these areas, right? And it's true. Israel is number one country in the world, that is, in terms of recipient of foreign assistance, particularly military aid. I think the other two, come Egypt, Afghanistan, I think, and Jordan. These are the top four or the recent years. But it's not only that. I mean, there is also the fact that Israel has become also a provider of a service to the United States. And we have to also see how that works out. The fact that the Israeli system, in particular intelligence system, its espionage, its ability to spy on and understand and analyze the region, has been a huge service to the United States. The idea that Israel is also manufacturing its own military equipment and weapons, very technologically advanced weapons, have been very much beneficial to some of the US interest. The fact that Israel has maintained, in a way, some of the US interest in the region in the course of the last decades. So there is a sort of also this kind of US is benefiting, and to be completely clear, when this military assistance is given, there's more conditionality, not on human rights or not violating international law on the side of Israel, but that Israel has to, the procurement or the beneficiaries of the military aid and assistance would be also the military industrial complex in the United States, so that they will not be harmed. It will be continue to operate and expand in the region. And we've seen how those so-called peace deals between Israel and UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan ultimately are really are arms deals, are at best normalization deals that really have nothing to do with peace, and certainly are not, as we have seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, are not going to stop Israel from committing war crimes and crimes against humanity against Palestinians. These are really serving the interest of very oppressive regimes, that Israel is now kind of the center of those kind of connections. There was a headline that was really stood out for me after Biden won the elections, that Israeli leaders, and particularly I think it was related to the Israeli government and Netanyahu, is asking Biden to go easy on the UAE and other Arab nations that are and have a peace deal with Israel because they're on their human rights record. So there is that sort of constant way of Israel's benefiting, but also the United States see it as part of expanding its presence, its interests, its militarization, and sustaining the military industrial complex, and in an imperial really interests that have been very much very well documented. The other thing that I think is important to see here is the histories of nations. That's why you see the connections and the solidarity that's happening between indigenous communities in the United States and Palestinian liberation movement, between Black American people of African descent and Black people in America and the Palestinian activists struggling against the Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism, because there is so much in common with regard to the origins of these nations and the countries as forms of, whether it's white supremacy in the United States, with the longest history, of course, of genocide and enslavement of people, Black people in particular, and segregation and so on. And then seeing settler colonialism in Israel and the Jewish supremacy, as now is term is much more commonly used, defining really how Israel has become a place where it is, there's one group, this is really for the benefit of one group, Jewish Israelis, to dominate another group, and using very similar very similar tactics, and including legal framework. When I took an Indian law class several years ago, which has struck me how some of the similarities around issues of jurisdiction between reservations and Indian nations, Indian tribes, and what Israel is doing now with the Palestinian Authority. Both on issues of criminal law and jurisdiction and access to courts and redress, who can really get access and things like that. But also in terms of just issues like, for example, the first thing that happened after the Oslo Accords was signed in the so-called Gaza and Jericho first, was that in Jericho, which was under Palestinian jurisdiction, we saw not the first, university, not the first huge, factory benefiting infrastructure or electric grid. We saw a first casino built in Jericho using the Palestinian jurisdiction and attracting Israeli tourists, settlers, to play in the casino. I went myself to visit, and to be completely honest, I played in the casino, and I was struck by what is this going on? And then when I looked at more, this is exactly what you have in the United States. The gaming industry in the tribe is the only forms of jurisdiction, of sovereignty. Of course, we have much less years. We hope that we don't get to become what indigenous peoples in the United States have become, and that's what our brothers and sisters are telling us here. That is why the resistance is so fierce and there's no normalization with this kind of oppression, because otherwise you'll end up being in these kind of reservations under Palestinian Authority that looks like a tribal authority that's running certain parts of the West Bank and maybe parts of Gaza.
Okay. Well, we seem to have shifted to the broader movement for Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation. Would you like to speak to that movement and maybe what's happened in the last months in your view, of whether there's been a shift in energy?
Yeah, I can totally speak to that. I do want to just take 1 minute to just expand a little bit on Jamil's use the word normalization, which I think is an important one for folks to know about. So I find it really helpful to think about it as a word. So it's basically, think of like you're hanging out with all of your friends and someone just has like a really horrible, like racist comment, right? And then everyone just sort of like, carries on as if that's a normal thing for people to say, right? That's really uncomfortable. And so someone has to say like, wait, we're just not going to ignore the fact that this just happened. So this is maybe a terrible analogy, but this is a little bit what Jamil is saying when he's saying normalization. Palestinians are saying, you cannot have business as usual with the Israeli government when these human rights violations are taking place on a daily basis. We cannot allow this to become a normal part of our lives, right? Of a normal part of anybody's lives. This is not acceptable to make this normal, right? So just wanted to clarify a little bit, because I think it's a really helpful frame to think about why people are making the decisions that they're making when they're saying they're not doing it because it's normalization, that's what's happening there. In terms of what happened in the past few weeks, I will say I was very, very heartened. I have been sort of part of the movement for Palestinian human rights since the early 2000s, at least. And there has been several moments of escalation in the last 20 years, right? There's been several times where the Israeli government or the Israeli military has escalated and has bombed Gaza, or has sort of incurred into different Palestinian territories, or that, various things have happened over the years. And each time it sort of feels a little bit like a thing that Palestinians and people who are in the Palestinian human rights movement are kind of breaking, like, knocking against walls, trying to find like people to hear what's going on for real, right? And not just see the sort of Israeli narrative of what's happening. And this past time, I really saw way more people really hear what's happening to Palestinians and really understand that this is a human rights issue, and that this isn't a sort of like a conflict between two warring sides, right? But that this is like somebody who has a ton of resources, a government that has eighth military in the world and dispossessed people and refugees and indigenous folks who have claims to the land. So I've been very heartened by that. I do think there's a shift happening. I really think that this past summer's moment around George Floyd and around what policing in this country has really shaped the way that people are thinking about these institutions in a different way. I really saw people go from not really thinking about the police at all to suddenly fully understanding why police were such a problem for Black people in this country and how violent has been and how violent it has been for many years. And that learning happened in a really short amount of time. And I think that has really helped people see this issue way more clearly. And I'm really heartened by that.
Okay, we have some questions. So I thought I'd just go through them one by one, although I think some of them have been addressed in the discussion. So the first one is, and I'm just going to read it. Pinkwashing is usually framed as a straw man issue. That is, Israel uses gay rights over here to distract from human rights abuses against Palestinians over there. Could you elaborate on how liberal formations of LGBT rights are implicated in the process of settler colonialism itself?
I would be happy to, honestly. So just to sort of repeat the question a little bit, if folks don't know what pinkwashing is, it's a term that's been circulating for quite some time now that essentially says that Israel is committing these human rights violations against Palestinians and is trying to distract you. It's saying like, but look, we have a gay pride parade and we have like fun gay people who are celebrities and come here and come party on the beach in Tel Aviv if you're a gay person and don't worry about what's happening behind the curtain, right? Like that's kind of what pinkwashing is. What the question is asking is, okay, but like, is it just a distraction or is there something else deeper going on with how we think about settler colonialism and thinking about LGBT rights? My answer is yes, there is something deeper going on, that it's not just a distraction. Previous versions of settler colonialism, right, British colonialism, thought that Arab people were too queer, right? That they were too effeminate, that they were too sort of soft, and that therefore the British needed to go in there and teach them proper masculinity and proper sort of heterosexual Christian ways of being, right? Now we see a little bit of a flip where being for gay rights is kind of seen as a barometer, right? Where like, if you're for gay rights, you are progressive, you are democratic, you understand what democracy is. If you are assumed to not be for gay rights, then you are undemocratic, you don't deserve to have a government. Israel should just take care of the Palestinians who don't quite know how to govern themselves. It's like a very colonial way of thinking, right? Often people who have these arguments will say that Palestinian civil code outlaws gay marriage or some version of that, and omit the reality, which is that civil code came from the British and that it was like a really British importation of homophobia into Palestinian culture. So I think the way in which, if you see people thinking about gay rights as like, oh, if they're for gay rights, they're somehow more democratic, that's where I see it really implicated in the process of settler colonialism.
Jamil, would you like to address that question, or shall I move to the next?
No, I think Tallie, has more expertise in this area, but I do think that it annoys me to see how so many liberals fall into this, in particular in the United States. Remember, having a conversation with a colleague, the ACLU, who thought that was a good idea to accept an invitation by the U.S. ambassador to Tel Aviv, Dan Shapiro, in celebrating the Pride Parade in Tel Aviv and showcasing American progressive achievements in the area of LGBTQ rights, and I had to have a long conversation with a number of colleagues that's really not the right thing to do. I think that we have to look beyond what the so-called shared values that are usually being marketed as between Israel and the US. And we are both democratic nations. We believe in the freedom and liberties, and particularly for minority rights, and we believe in religious freedom, and we believe in LGBTQ rights. and there's no real deep understanding of the histories of what is this, what does that mean, particularly for the most discriminated communities, marginalized and indigenous communities. What does that do to them in terms of how it's being used? What is really hopeful to me to see the new generation of activists, by the way, including Palestinian queer activists in Palestine, but also here in the US, are resisting this, and they are on the forefront of saying no, we are not going to fall into this, and they're urging both the organizations as well as businesses and other entities to boycott and to divest, and not to give legitimacy to this in the name of gay rights that we could turn, and including in Israel itself. I mean, I can tell you there are many Israeli friends that I know who are active in against this pinkwashing. They think this is one of the worst thing that it could be done, and it's harmful. It only makes things worse. And but the Israeli Hasbara, as it says, the propaganda continues to do everything in order to dehumanize Palestinians and to portray us as ones who are violent, ones who are not tolerant of any person's rights, and that's something that is part of the struggle. It really gets into your, it makes you feel that you have to be defensive and not focus on the real struggle from the real oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say one more thing, which is that, I mean, Israel likes to say that it's very for gay rights, and I'm sure Pride at Tel Aviv is a good time for some people, but Israel is not an exceptionally good at gay rights. Gay marriage is not legal there. There's a lot of very violent homophobia in Israeli society, in Jewish Israeli society. So there is not, I just want to be very clear that that is just propaganda that's being used, and it is not accurate in any way. And the occupation and the occupation of the apartheid system harms gay and lesbian and queer Palestinians just as much as it harms any other Palestinian. So it kind of falls apart when you think about it.
The next question is, could we hear from both Mr. Dakwar and Ms. Ben-Daniel about what the deal regarding ousting Netanyahu might mean for Palestinians, and if there's anything we as Americans can do in response?
Sure, I can take this one. Look, there's nothing going to change as far as Palestinians. That's the ultimate bottom line. If anything, this new government is a government that is not agreeing on anything but ousting Netanyahu. That is what this goal is about. It is going to be dealing with really maybe putting out some fires here and there, pretending that they are calming things down, within Israeli society in particular, because of what happened with the under Netanyahu government in terms of the polarization and racism and hatred that he pursued. But they're not really addressing the root causes of the problem. The structural racism, really, the attacks and the delegitimization against Palestinians, Palestinian citizens, particularly inside Israel. But more importantly, this government will not have any interest in addressing and recognizing the Palestinian rights and coming to end to the oppression that's happening whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza. So I think it's actually a even worse and maybe more dangerous, because it gives the impression that the guy who was just like Trump is now gone, and so we can celebrate because we have some more less dangerous person or less dangerous administration in Israel. But the person who will poised to lead the Israeli government, Naftali Bennett, is even worse than Netanyahu as far as his ideological nationalist views and racism. And I urge you all to just go online and check out the statements that he made about being proud of killing Arabs, of his hatred and his belief that no other than the Jewish people have the right to live there. and so on. So this is going to be another attempt to take advantage of the fact that there are some consensus to replace Netanyahu for the purpose of maintaining the status quo, but not really making anything different. And if anything, I think it will be very unstable government, and may cause more harm, because they could be shifting the attention and the seriousness of the situation from what was happening under the Netanyahu government.
Tallie?
I don't know that I have much to add. I mean, I think it's significant in that Netanyahu was prime minister for 12 years, and obviously it's going to be different under somebody else. And Naftali Bennett is undoubtedly worse and more to the right and more racist and more nationalist. And so it's not, yeah. In terms of what anything as Americans can do to response, I'm part of an activist organization. So I would say be an activist on the issue and join an organization that works on this issue. And specifically, I think there's a lot of hope in Congress right now. We have more people elected to Congress more than ever before who are open to hearing about Palestinian issues. It's still not enough, I think, to really tip the scales, but it's enough to get us started somewhere. So I think that it can make an impact.
Okay. The next question is, who leads the Palestinians? I hear a lot about poor Palestinian leadership being the cause of their bad living circumstances, or Hamas being poor leaders, as though they are the political and governmental entity in charge of Palestinians. I think it's important to understand who represents and who is in charge of Palestinians.
Well, it's always the case of it's kind of a known playbook. You blame it on the victim. You try to portray as the people who are being oppressed as the one who have to be blamed for and taking responsibility for their bad conditions, right? To distract from attention and from the real oppression and systemic racism. In the case of the Palestinians, I don't think that there was ever a time when they had been able to form and to be able to have their own leadership safe and be able to represent them. We've been, as Palestinian people, have been under the leadership has been constant attacks, assassinations, exile, deportation, imprisonment, criminalization, and all sorts of other ways, and silencing people to the extent that they cannot expect that it would be that easy. Take, for example, the case of East Jerusalem. Israel intentionally made it impossible for Palestinian communities, which is a very large community. About 40% of the people who live in Jerusalem are Palestinians that have no leadership whatsoever. They have made sure that they closed down all the institutions that were affiliated with the PLO, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or any other significant form of institution that would give the Palestinians a space to grow some leadership. And so what ends up happening is they always wanted to see leaders who are willing to agree to the diktat of the Israeli government, and coming even from the United States government. And that's where you see those individuals, like, for example, Mansour Abbas, the guy who just now agreed to join as a Palestinian leader from within Israel to join this coalition to oust Netanyahu. And I can tell you that he's not representing the vast majority of Palestinian citizens, especially after what happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. The same applies to the leadership of the Palestinians in Ramallah, including some of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, whether it's issues of corruption, whether it's violations of human rights, of suppression, of activism, political dissent, and subcontracting to Israel, and that's the major really role that Israel sees with the Palestinian Authority, and then all the way to the Hamas leadership, which has, in a way or another, had shown flexibility to adapt to the reality on the ground, and in some ways have lived through it, but at the same time was created because of what Israel did. In 1992, Israel deported 415 Palestinians mainly from all over the West Bank, but also mainly from Gaza to the South Lebanon. And most of the people who were there were affiliated with Hamas and Jihad Islami, were barely known to the Palestinians or to the world. Those 415 Palestinians were deported and stayed for almost a year in a no man's zone in an area that Israel was occupying, South Lebanon at the time, and ultimately was allowed to return back, became one of the leaders of the Hamas movement, Hamas in Gaza and some of it in the West Bank. So there's that sort of way that Israel has made people, some people more have access to power, access to leadership, and some denied others this same privileges based on what they could do to maintain the status quo, or worse, contribute to the suppression and oppression of the Palestinian people.
Okay. Tallie, would you like to address, or shall I move on? Okay. The next question is, can the panelists discuss how the United States is complicit in terms of UN vetoes and anti-BDS laws and initiatives?
Yeah, totally. I will say that in the earlier question about like, what is the US role? This is one of them. Aside from the military funding that we give Israel, we have, in the previous escalation, we blocked, I think, 3 or 4 UN votes that were going to be in support of Palestine. So our role in the UN, especially in the Security Council, I think is a huge barrier to any kind of international recognition to the Palestinian struggle in that body. One of the things that my organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, believes is that if we can move to the US, right, if we can get the US kind of out of the way, that'll actually really help the possibility of justice for Palestinians, that the US is a big barrier to seeing justice.
Yeah, there's a history of US giving diplomatic cover to Israel. In the last decades, I think at least 53 or 54 times that the United States acted in order to provide that kind of protection using the veto power as a permanent member of the Security Council. And we know that this has exacerbated the problem. It has not solved the problem. For American and Israeli politics, it may have solved some problems for their political problems, but it have not solved the problem of Palestinians, and certainly not for Jewish Israelis, whether they are living in settlers or otherwise. But that has been a serious flaw in American and US foreign policy. But it's really driven by, again, back to the point that I made earlier, by US interests. US foreign policy interests has not been in good faith. They are not being consistent and principled as far as promoting international law, peace and security, and international law rules-based order, as our Secretary of State Blinken has told us several weeks ago. And yet, when it comes to the situation in Palestine, there's an exception to that rule. There's some ways that doesn't apply here. When the International Criminal Court pursues investigation of war crimes, of not just Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the West Bank and Gaza, but even war crimes committed by Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza, the US, under all administration, not just the Trump administration, including in the recent administration, Biden administration, said we disagree with this investigation. We should not be, there should not be any jurisdiction, even though most serious legal scholars would disagree with the US position. And that is really driven by the interest of shielding Israel from accountability, from any form of accountability, whether the Security Council, whether at the Human Rights Council, whether it's at the International Criminal Court now, seeing the US under Trump sanctioning the prosecutor, criminalize and basically issuing a special executive order that barring the chief prosecutor from visiting the United States just because it had pursued cases against US personnel committed war crimes in Afghanistan. But of course, the main drive was also protecting Israel from such accountability. So I think that there is so much that American citizens can do and should do, because that is done in their name. And I think most Americans are not paying attention to foreign policy. And it's not just in the Middle East. It's not just on the Palestine question. I think it applies also in other parts of the world, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, or in Europe for that matter. We have to be more responsible for what our government does, what it does for with our military, what it does with our taxpayers' money, what it does in the name of protecting human rights, while we know that there is a cherry picking of where do we really go and spread democracy and human rights. And so this kind of hypocrisy is somehow always come and haunt us, comes really, there's a heavy price for that, because people are not buying it again. And people, including, as Tallie said, people in Congress are pushing back. It's a growing small minority of members of Congress. We've never had that before. We've had 100 senators signing letters in support of Israel. Now we have 17 senators signing letters that, with regard to rebuilding Gaza, they have to go more than that. It's not enough. We have members of Congress sponsoring legislation that says that there should be suspension or at least some restrictions to U.S. Foreign military assistance to Israel, particularly when military assistance and equipment is used to violate human rights, which actually is a no-brainer. It's a violation of U.S. law, not just international law. When it comes to export law, when it comes to us providing certain equipment, certain weapons that violate, or certain training for that purposes to military or law enforcement that violate human rights. This is something that the United States does all over the world. And we have the Leahy Amendment, we have the State Department reports that talk about these things. And yet when it comes to the state of Israel, there's an exception to the state of Israel. There's always something that shields the state from that. And now I think we are in a point of no turning back in terms of accountability, in terms of setting a real accountability standards when it comes to relationship between Israel and the United States. Because I think no one can really anymore deny the reality on the ground that Israel is a settler colonial power. It is committing the crime of apartheid and persecution, as recently analyzed by Human Rights Watch. And I think it's only a matter of time when we will see a greater numbers of people have the guts, have the courage to take action and do something. It's not going to come from Congress right away. It's going to come from movement, from organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, from campaigners like the organization that I'm on their board, Adalah Justice Project. Like the solidarity that we're seeing is unprecedented. Seeing that this is not just about ending U.S. militarization in the context of Palestine, but it's also ending militarization in the context of the United States, here at home, ending Pentagon 1033 program of selling, or not selling, but really providing local state law enforcement with military weapons that are used in warfare. These are all connected issues. What we do abroad, our militarization abroad, has an impact on our civil liberties and human rights here. Our criminalization abroad, or what happens in the name of protecting particular country, is really has an impact on how we live our values, and we really hold our democracy as a strong one that is inclusive. That it really says that what people really mean by saying we are for these freedoms and for basic human rights.
Okay. Thank you. So we've reached time and we need to wrap, but I'd like to give each of you 30 seconds, if you would, to maybe let people know where they can get more information if they're interested.
I can start us off. If you're interested, there's a ton of information on the JVP website. So that's jvp.org. You can also go to jewishvoiceforpeace.org. If you're brand new to the, and you're like, I have no idea what just happened. I've been here for an hour and 15 minutes. I strongly recommend a book by Phyllis Bennis called Understanding the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. It's a really good primer, even though I also think it's not a conflict. I do think it has some good factual information in it. So those are two resources that I think could be places to go if you're wanting some more information.
I would urge everyone to look at Adalah, the organization that I worked for back in Israel in Haifa. Their website is Adalah, adalah.org. And there's a lot of information about Israeli laws, the situation that's happening now. Obviously, I would recommend also visiting Al-Haq and Al-Mizan and Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Al-Mizan and Palestinian Center for Human Rights are based in Gaza. Al-Haq is based in Ramallah, as well as the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, one of the premier organizations that actually also came out earlier this year with a briefing paper with basically analyzing Israel as an apartheid state. And finally, here in the US, I urge you to look at the Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which is an umbrella campaign of many organizations, including Adalah Justice Project and many organizations, faith-based organizations, etc., that work really tirelessly in order to promote Palestinian rights in the United States. And if you're interested in legal stuff, in legislation that threatens First Amendment rights in the United States, I encourage you to look at Palestine Legal. It's one of I think the only organizations devoted to protecting First Amendment rights of people who are advocating and supporting Palestinian rights in the United States, including supporting Palestinian rights activism on college campuses. Check them out and support them if you can. There's a lot that you can do, especially if you are a law student and when you graduate. If you go to law firms, you gotta have to take a role and responsibility. It doesn't end with just listening. And while we appreciate that, I think everyone has to do something in order to bring the situation to a point where we can all think about the situation in an equal terms of how can we create the environment for Palestinians to be able to protect their rights, just as Israeli Jewish people have the right to enjoy safety and equality, as our administration is telling us. Let's prove it. Let's see how you do it. And you do it by dismantling structure of racism and systemic institutional discrimination. And when you start to treat people equally, with equal dignity, with equal access to human rights and freedoms, then things become a little bit more. But if you were just doing hierarchy of peoples based on religion or based on political interest, then we are not going to solve the problem. We'll make it even worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much for sharing your time and your knowledge. Thanks to Sadaf Dust and Samir Asher for the planning of this event. Thank you for Rabi Kadri and Aaron Hebert for handling the details and the Zoom. And thank you for all who attended. And I hope there will be more events. So thank you.
Thank you all
We'll
very
stop the
much.
recording.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Mhm.